The candle on the long oak table burned low, and Alina Whitmore's hand trembled as she reached for the folded letter with the royal seal pressed into red wax. Her fingers froze halfway. A letter like this had never come to her small house at the edge of town, not once in her 24 years, and she already sensed that whatever was written inside would change everything. She broke the seal. The paper crackled. Her eyes moved fast over the elegant handwriting, and her breath caught. She had been invited to the Royal Symposium of Scholars, an event held once every 3 years inside the palace halls, where the finest minds in the kingdom gathered to debate history, language, and old forgotten texts. Her name, Alina Whitmore, daughter of the late historian Charles Whitmore, had been written among a list of honored guests. She read it twice, then 3 times because she could not believe it. Her father had died 4 years earlier, leaving behind nothing but debts, a crumbling house, and shelves of ancient books that most people in town thought were worthless. He had been a quiet scholar, never wealthy, never famous, but deeply respected by a small circle of old friends who remembered his brilliance. It seemed one of those old friends, now holding a position at the palace, had not forgotten him. The invitation was a courtesy, a nod to a name from the past. Alina understood that clearly. No one at the palace expected her to speak, to debate, or to be taken seriously. She was simply being allowed through the door because of a name that used to matter. Still, her heart pounded with something she had not felt in years: excitement. She walked to the narrow bookshelf that lined the far wall of her small sitting room and ran her fingers along the spines of old leather-bound volumes. Latin grammars, Greek primers, fragments of ancient poetry copied by hand. Her father had never been able to afford a tutor for her, and no proper school in the kingdom accepted girls into their halls of language and history. So he had taught her himself, late at night, by candlelight, whispering conjugations and declensions like secrets passed between conspirators. When he grew too tired to teach, she taught herself, poring over dusty texts until her eyes ached and the words blurred into shapes she somehow still understood. She had never been allowed to prove what she knew, not in any hall that mattered, not to anyone who counted. Now, for the first time, she had been given a door into that world, even if it was only cracked open a finger's width. Her closest friend, Margaret Colton, arrived that evening carrying a basket of bread and a look of barely contained curiosity. Margaret worked as a seamstress in town and had known Alina since they were girls chasing chickens through the same muddy lane. When Alina showed her the letter, Margaret's mouth fell open. "The palace," Margaret said, her voice hushed as though the walls might report her. "Alina, you are going to the palace." "I am going to a room full of scholars who have never heard my name and will not care to learn it," Alina said, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite her words. "It is only a courtesy invitation. My father's old friend arranged it. I doubt anyone there will speak 2 words to me." "Then you will speak first," Margaret said simply, as if the matter were already settled. Alina laughed, but the sound was thin, nervous. She had never stood before important people. She had never worn a gown fine enough for a palace hall. She had never been given a reason to test everything she had quietly learned in the shadows of her father's study. That night after Margaret left, Alina sat alone at the table with the letter in front of her and her father's oldest notebook open beside it. The notebook was filled with his handwriting, cramped and hurried, notes on ancient manuscripts he had studied throughout his life. One page near the back caught her eye. It was a passage he had never finished translating, a fragment of old text he described as strange, twisted, resistant to easy meaning. He had written a single line beneath it: "Someday, someone patient enough will solve this properly." Alina traced the words with her fingertip. She wondered, briefly and foolishly, if that day might somehow be close. She spent the following days preparing in the only way she knew how. She could not afford new gowns or jewelry, so Margaret altered one of Alina's mother's old dresses, a deep green fabric that had faded gracefully with time but still held its elegance in the candlelight. Alina read late into the night, reviewing old texts, refreshing memories of grammar rules she had not touched in months. She told herself she was not preparing for anything specific. There was no reason to believe anyone at the symposium would ask her a single question about language. She would likely stand quietly at the edge of the hall, nod politely to strangers, and return home with nothing more than a memory of grand chandeliers and fine music. Yet some quiet part of her kept whispering that she should be ready. The day of the symposium arrived cold and bright. Alina rode into the city in a hired carriage, watching the streets grow wider and busier as they approached the palace gates. Guards in polished uniforms stood at attention along the entrance, and beyond them rose towers of pale stone that seemed to touch the low winter clouds. She had seen the palace from a distance her whole life, a shape on the horizon, a symbol of a world she was never meant to enter. Now the carriage rolled directly toward its gates, and her stomach twisted with a mixture of wonder and fear. Inside, the halls were more beautiful than she had imagined. High ceilings painted with scenes of old battles and older gods, long red carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps. Servants moving quietly along the edges of the room, carrying trays of wine and delicate pastries. Alina walked slowly, trying not to stare too openly at the grandeur around her, though her eyes kept lifting to study the painted ceilings and carved columns. The symposium hall itself was already filling with guests when she arrived. Scholars in fine robes clustered in small groups, exchanging greetings and quiet debates. She recognized none of the faces, though she caught fragments of conversation about ancient trade routes, disputed translations, and forgotten kingdoms. Her heart beat faster listening to them. These were the sorts of conversations she had only ever had with her father, alone, in a small house far from anywhere important. A tall man with silver hair and kind eyes approached her near the entrance, extending a hand in greeting. "You must be Alina Whitmore," he said warmly. "I am Professor Aldrich Bennington. Your father and I studied together many years ago before either of us had gray hair or important titles." He smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I am glad you came. Charles would be proud to see you here." Alina felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you for the invitation, Professor. I was surprised to receive it." "Nonsense," Bennington said, waving a hand. "Your father spoke of you often in the last years before his passing. He believed you understood languages better than most men who hold chairs at this very palace." I confess I was curious to see if his pride was simply a father's affection, or something closer to truth. Before Alina could answer, a ripple of movement passed through the crowd near the hall's grand doorway. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A tall figure entered, dressed in deep blue robes trimmed with silver thread, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in a room. Alina did not need to be told who he was. Everything about his bearing announced it. "Duke Edmund Ashcombe," Bennington murmured beside her, his voice dropping slightly. "He holds the royal chair of ancient languages, brilliant by most accounts. Also, I regret to say, rather full of his own brilliance." The Duke moved through the hall like a man collecting admiration as he walked, nodding here, offering a clipped word there, clearly enjoying the attention his presence commanded. Alina watched him with quiet curiosity, unaware that within the hour his path would cross hers in a way neither of them expected. The evening continued with polite introductions and quiet conversation, wine poured generously, and small groups forming and reforming across the wide hall. Alina found herself standing near a table displaying an old manuscript under glass, its pages yellowed with age, its script elegant and foreign. She leaned closer, studying the visible lines with quiet fascination, her lips moving slightly as she read the Latin phrases silently to herself. "Careful," a voice said behind her, smooth and faintly amused. "That glass has been known to fool visitors into thinking they understand more than they do." Alina turned to find the Duke standing just behind her, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth, though his eyes held none of the warmth Bennington's had shown. "I was only admiring the script," Alina said evenly. "It is a beautiful hand." "Beautiful, yes," the Duke agreed, stepping closer to the glass case, glancing down at the ancient text with practiced familiarity. "Though I doubt many in this hall could read a single line of it properly. Latin is not a language easily borrowed. It demands years of study, discipline most people simply do not possess." "I imagine that is true," Alina said carefully, sensing something sharpening beneath his tone. The Duke studied her for a moment, taking in her simple green gown, her lack of jewelry, her unfamiliar face among the palace's usual guests. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of dismissive curiosity. "Forgive me, I do not believe we have been introduced. You are not one of the regular faces at these gatherings." "Alina Whitmore," she said, offering a small, polite nod. "My father was Charles Whitmore, a historian. I was invited by Professor Bennington." Recognition passed briefly across the Duke's face, though it did nothing to soften his expression. "Ah. Whitmore, I recall the name faintly. A modest scholar, if I remember correctly. Never held a chair at any respectable institution, did he?" The words landed with quiet precision, cutting without shouting, the way only practiced cruelty could. Alina felt her spine straighten instinctively. "He was a private scholar," she said, keeping her voice level. "He studied for the love of it, not for titles." "How admirable," the Duke said, though the word carried no admiration at all. His gaze drifted back toward the glass case, toward the ancient script glowing faintly under the candlelight. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, since you seem so interested in this particular text, can you read Latin?" The question hung in the air, simple on its surface, but Alina understood immediately that it was not truly a question. It was a test disguised as conversation, and she suspected the Duke had already decided what her answer would prove. Several nearby guests had turned slightly, drawn by the shift in the Duke's tone, sensing the small performance beginning to unfold. Alina felt the weight of attention settling onto her shoulders, unfamiliar and heavy. "I have studied it," she said simply, refusing to overstate or understate the truth. The Duke's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. He turned toward the small cluster of scholars who had gathered nearby, raising his voice just enough to be heard across the group. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Miss Alina Whitmore, daughter of a private historian who claims to have studied Latin." He turned back toward her, his expression carrying open amusement now, performing for the small audience he had gathered. "Forgive my bluntness, Miss Whitmore, but I find that difficult to believe. Women are rarely permitted proper instruction in the classical languages, and self-teaching, however admirable in spirit, tends to produce more confidence than competence." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the small crowd, some polite, some genuine, all of it landing on Alina like small stones. She felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her expression composed, refusing to give him the satisfaction of visible distress. "She can't read Latin," the Duke said, his smirk widening as he glanced around at his audience, clearly pleased with the reaction he had produced. "Not truly, not in any way that would survive real scrutiny." Alina said nothing at first. She simply looked at him, steady and unblinking, allowing the silence to stretch a moment longer than comfort allowed. Something in her expression made a few of the surrounding scholars shift uneasily, sensing perhaps that the Duke's confidence had been placed on ground far less solid than he believed. Professor Bennington, who had drifted closer during the exchange, watched Alina carefully, his eyes narrowing with quiet interest rather than concern. He had known Charles Whitmore. He remembered, faintly, comments made years ago about a daughter who absorbed language the way dry earth absorbed rain. He said nothing yet, choosing instead to observe, curious to see how Alina would respond to the challenge laid so carelessly at her feet. "You are entitled to your opinion of me, Your Grace," Alina said finally, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough volume to reach the small crowd without straining. "Though I would gently suggest that opinions formed before any evidence is examined tend to say more about the one holding them than the one being judged." A few soft gasps rippled through the nearby guests, quickly followed by hushed murmurs. The Duke's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, clearly unaccustomed to being met with anything other than agreement or silence. "Bold words," he said, his tone cooling. "Though words alone prove little in a hall built on scholarship, Miss Whitmore, perhaps you would care to demonstrate this evidence you speak of, rather than simply promising it exists." Alina felt her heartbeat quicken, though not entirely from fear. Something steadier had begun to settle beneath her nerves, a quiet resolve she recognized from countless nights spent hunched over her father's books, refusing to give up on a passage until she had wrestled it into meaning. "I would be glad to," she said simply. The Duke's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly not expecting such immediate acceptance. Before he could respond, Professor Bennington stepped forward, a thoughtful expression crossing his face, one that suggested an idea had just taken shape in his mind. "Perhaps," he said slowly, addressing the small crowd rather than either Alina or the Duke directly, "this disagreement need not remain a matter of words at all." The hall's attention, already partially drawn toward the exchange, began shifting more fully in Bennington's direction. He glanced toward Alina, then toward the Duke, his expression carefully neutral, though something in his eyes suggested quiet enjoyment at the shape the evening was beginning to take. "There happens to be a manuscript," Bennington continued, "that has sat unresolved in the Royal Archive for many years. A passage within it has defeated every scholar who has attempted a full translation, myself included. Perhaps this disagreement could be settled properly, with evidence rather than opinion." The Duke's expression shifted, curiosity mixing with the faint discomfort of a man realizing a private jab had begun sliding toward something far more public than he intended. Around them, the small crowd of scholars leaned in slightly, sensing that the evening's polite gathering was about to become something far more memorable. Alina stood quietly amid the gathering attention, her hands folded in front of her expression calm on the surface, though beneath it her mind had already begun turning toward the challenge taking shape. She did not yet know what the manuscript contained, what words waited inside its stubborn, unresolved lines. But she understood, with a clarity that steadied her nerves rather than shook them further, that whatever happened next would decide far more than a single evening's conversation. It would decide whether the door cracked open by a courtesy invitation would swing wide, or close forever. The candles along the hall's walls flickered gently, as a servant was quietly sent to retrieve the manuscript from the archive, and the murmur of anticipation spread through the gathered scholars like a current moving beneath still water. Alina felt every eye in the room settling upon her, and for the first time since stepping through the palace gates, she allowed herself to feel not fear, but something closer to readiness. Whatever waited on those old, yellowed pages, she intended to meet it without flinching. The servant returned within minutes, carrying a flat wooden box lined with faded velvet, moving carefully as though the object inside weighed far more than its size suggested. He set it upon a side table near the center of the hall, and Professor Bennington lifted the lid with the practiced gentleness of a man who had handled fragile things his entire life. Inside lay a single sheet of ancient parchment, protected beneath a thin pane of glass, its edges brittle and darkened with age. The script covering its surface was dense, cramped, written in a hand that seemed to fight against the very language it recorded. Alina leaned forward slightly, studying the visible lines from a respectful distance, and felt a small thrill move through her chest despite the tension of the moment. "This fragment was recovered nearly 40 years ago," Bennington explained to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying easily across the quiet hall. "It came from the ruins of an old monastery library, along with several other texts, most of which were translated without much difficulty. This particular passage, however, has resisted every attempt. The grammar appears sound at first glance, yet the meaning collapses under close reading. Several scholars, myself included, have concluded the original scribe may have made errors in copying, or perhaps intentionally obscured the meaning for reasons lost to history." The Duke stepped closer to the glass case, his earlier smirk fading into something more focused, more genuinely curious despite himself. "I recall this fragment," he said slowly. "I attempted a translation some years ago. I concluded the passage referenced an old philosophical dispute regarding the nature of memory, though admittedly several lines remained unclear even in my final version." "Your published translation," Bennington said mildly, "was widely praised if I remember correctly." "It was accepted as the standard interpretation," the Duke said, a note of pride slipping back into his voice. "Though I confess, even I found certain phrases stubborn." Elinor listened carefully, filing away every detail. If the Duke's own translation had already been accepted as the standard interpretation, any attempt she made would inevitably be measured directly against his work. The thought sent a fresh wave of nerves through her stomach, though she pushed it down, reminding herself that nerves solved nothing. Only careful, patient reading would matter now. Bennington turned toward the wider crowd, spreading his hands slightly in a gesture that invited attention. "It seems fitting, given tonight's conversation, that we allow Miss Whitmore the opportunity to examine this passage herself. Not to compete against His Grace's earlier work directly, but simply to demonstrate her own understanding, on her own terms." A murmur passed through the gathered scholars, some skeptical, some intrigued, a few already exchanging quiet wagers under their breath about how the evening might unfold. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, sensing the shift in the room's attention, though he masked it quickly behind a thin smile. "By all means," he said, spreading his own hands in a mocking echo of Bennington's gesture. "I would be curious to see what conclusions Miss Whitmore reaches. Perhaps she will succeed where the rest of us have struggled. Or perhaps this evening will simply confirm what most already suspect." Elinor met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the challenge in his voice unsettle her outward calm. "I will do my best to read what is written," she said simply. "Nothing more and nothing less." A tall woman near the edge of the crowd, dressed in scholars' robes of deep burgundy, stepped forward slightly, addressing the group with quiet authority. "If this is to be a proper demonstration," she said, "it should be conducted fairly. Miss Whitmore should be given a reasonable amount of time, free from interruption, with the same reference materials any of us would be permitted to use." Bennington nodded in agreement. "A fair suggestion, Professor Caldwell. We have a smaller study room adjoining this hall, quiet and well lit. Miss Whitmore may work there, undisturbed, for as long as she requires." The Duke's smile sharpened slightly at the mention of unlimited time. "How generous," he murmured, though his tone carried a note of doubt, as if he expected the extra time to prove nothing more than a slower path toward the same failure he anticipated. Elinor felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as the small crowd began murmuring amongst themselves, some already placing quiet bets on the outcome. A young scholar near the back, barely older than Elinor herself, leaned toward his companion and whispered something that drew a soft laugh. She caught only fragments of it, something about odds and foolishness, but she refused to let it settle into her chest. She had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who had never once opened the books she had. "Before we proceed," the Duke said, raising his voice slightly to reclaim the room's attention, "let us make this arrangement worthwhile. A demonstration without stakes teaches us little about conviction." He turned toward Elinor, his eyes glinting with something between amusement and challenge. "If your translation proves sound, Miss Whitmore, I will personally acknowledge your skill before this entire assembly, and I will submit a formal recommendation for your inclusion among the palace's recognized scholars, a rare honor, as I am sure you understand." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd at the boldness of the offer. Bennington's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly not expecting the Duke to commit to something so significant. "And if I fail?" Elinor asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden tightening in her chest. The Duke's smile widened, confidence returning fully to his expression. "Then you will acknowledge before this same assembly that your father's teachings, however well-intentioned, were no substitute for proper formal instruction. And you will withdraw any claim to scholarly standing within these halls, tonight and going forward." The hall fell quiet, the weight of the wager settling over the gathered guests. Elinor felt her pulse quicken, the stakes suddenly far heavier than she had anticipated. To fail would not simply mean personal embarrassment. It would mean publicly surrendering the memory of her father's patient teaching, the countless nights he had spent guiding her through difficult texts despite his own exhaustion, despite a world that told him such effort on a daughter's behalf was wasted. She thought, briefly, of turning away from the wager altogether, of simply demonstrating her ability quietly without such heavy consequences attached. But something in the Duke's confident smile, the easy assumption that she would surely fail, hardened her resolve rather than weakening it. "I accept," Elinor said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the hushed hall without wavering. A fresh murmur rippled through the crowd, louder this time, mixing surprise with growing interest. Professor Caldwell, the woman in burgundy robes, offered Elinor a small, approving nod, though she said nothing aloud. Bennington's expression carried something closer to quiet pride, though concern flickered briefly beneath it as well. A father's old friend worried for a young woman about to face a challenge far larger than she perhaps realized. The servant carefully lifted the glass-covered parchment from its velvet case and carried it toward the adjoining study room, Elinor following a few steps behind, aware of the many eyes tracking her departure. The Duke watched her go, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable beneath its practiced calm. The study room was smaller than the grand hall, warmly lit by tall candles set along the walls, with a single wide desk positioned near the center beneath a high window that let in a sliver of moonlight. Bookshelves lined two of the walls, filled with reference texts, dictionaries, and grammatical guides accumulated over decades. The servant placed the manuscript carefully upon the desk and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Elinor alone with the ancient text and the quiet weight of everything riding upon it. She stood still for a long moment, simply breathing, allowing the silence of the room to settle her racing thoughts. Outside, she could hear the faint murmur of the gathered crowd, muffled by the heavy wooden door, waiting, watching the minutes pass. She pushed the sound from her mind as best she could, focusing instead on the desk before her, the parchment beneath its protective glass, the countless small marks of ink that had waited patiently for someone willing to read them properly. She pulled out the chair and sat, drawing a fresh sheet of paper toward her, dipping a quill into the inkwell provided. Her hand hovered above the page for a moment, steadying itself, before she leaned forward to study the manuscript more closely. The script was indeed dense, the letters crowded tightly together in the manner of scribes attempting to conserve costly parchment. She read the opening lines slowly, translating them silently in her mind, recognizing familiar grammatical structures, familiar vocabulary drawn from philosophical texts she had studied years earlier under her father's patient guidance. The early portion of the passage matched closely with what the Duke had apparently already translated, a discussion of memory and its unreliable nature, common themes among ancient philosophers wrestling with questions of truth and perception. But as she moved deeper into the text, she began to notice something the earlier translations seemed to have overlooked. A particular verb, repeated 3 times throughout the passage, carried a meaning that shifted subtly depending on the tense and mood in which the scribe had written it. Most translators, she suspected, had applied a single consistent meaning throughout, smoothing over the inconsistency rather than questioning it. But her father had taught her, many years ago, to never assume consistency where ancient texts were concerned. Scribes were human, language shifted. A word could carry different weight depending on where it fell within a sentence's structure. She began writing notes in the margin of her own paper, working through each instance of the troublesome verb separately, testing different possible meanings against the surrounding context. The process was slow, deliberate, each small decision building carefully upon the last. Time slipped away from her awareness entirely, the outside world fading as she sank fully into the rhythm of translation, the same rhythm she had practiced countless nights in her father's quiet study. At some point she paused, setting down her quill and rubbed gently at her tired eyes. She had made progress, more progress than she had expected given the manuscript's reputation for defeating even experienced scholars, but she sensed she had not yet reached the heart of what made this passage so resistant to clear meaning. Something deeper still eluded her, hidden somewhere within the tangled grammar of the final lines. She thought of her father then, vividly, the way he used to sit across from her at their small kitchen table, patiently waiting while she wrestled with a difficult passage, never rushing her, never offering the answer too quickly, always insisting that struggle itself was part of true understanding. She could almost hear his voice now, steady and warm, reminding her that even the most stubborn text eventually surrendered its meaning to a reader patient enough to keep asking the right questions. Alina picked up her quill again, straightened her shoulders, and leaned back over the ancient parchment, determined to find whatever answer waited within its final, unresolved lines. Outside the study room, the murmur of the gathered crowd had grown quieter, patience beginning to wear thin among some of the younger scholars, though Professor Bennington remained near the door, arms folded, watching it with quiet, unwavering attention. The Duke stood near the center of the hall, engaged in polite conversation with several colleagues, though his eyes drifted repeatedly toward the closed study room door, his earlier confidence beginning to carry a faint undercurrent of curiosity he did not entirely welcome. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still the door remained closed. Alina's mind drifted, briefly and unbidden, back to a winter evening many years earlier, when she had been no older than 12, sitting across from her father at their old kitchen table while snow gathered thickly against the window panes. The fire had burned low, and her father, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the cold, had placed an open book between them, its pages filled with dense Latin verse. "Read it aloud," he had told her, his voice patient despite his obvious exhaustion after a long day of tutoring wealthier children in town, children whose families paid him modestly for lessons he delivered without complaint, though none of those lessons were ever meant for her. "Do not worry about understanding every word yet. Simply let the sounds settle into your ear." She had stumbled through the unfamiliar syllables, her young tongue tripping over consonant clusters that felt foreign and awkward. Her father had smiled gently, correcting her pronunciation here and there, never once showing frustration at her mistakes. "Latin is not memorized," he told her. "It is befriended. You must spend time with it, the way you spend time with an old neighbor, until its habits become familiar to you." She remembered asking him that same evening why he bothered teaching her at all, when the schools in town would never allow her to sit among their pupils regardless of what she learned. His expression had grown serious then, though not sad. "Because knowledge belongs to whoever is willing to seek it," he had said. "The world may close its doors to you in many places, Alina, but no one can close the door inside your own mind unless you allow them to. What you learn here in this small kitchen will always belong to you, regardless of what any school or hall decides you deserve." She had not understood the full weight of those words as a child. She understood them now, sitting alone in a palace study room, an ancient manuscript spread before her, the fate of her father's memory resting quietly upon whatever conclusion she managed to reach. She shook the memory gently from her mind and returned her attention to the parchment, reading once more through the final lines that had resisted her efforts. The troublesome verb appeared a fourth time near the passage's conclusion, though in a slightly different grammatical form than the previous 3 instances. She frowned, studying it closely, comparing its ending carefully against the earlier examples. A small detail caught her attention, something she had overlooked in her first pass through the text. The final instance of the verb was not, in fact, identical to the earlier 3. A single letter differed, subtle enough that a hurried reader might easily mistake it for a simple copying error, the kind scribes occasionally made when working long hours by poor candlelight. But Alina had learned, through years of careful study, that such small differences often carried significant meaning rather than simple mistake. She reached for one of the reference texts lining the study room's shelves, a thick grammatical guide covering irregular verb forms across several centuries of Latin usage. She flipped through its pages carefully, searching for any documented variation matching the pattern she had noticed. After several minutes of careful searching, she found a brief mention, tucked within a footnote discussing regional dialectical shifts common among certain monastic communities during a particular historical period. The footnote explained that some scribes, particularly those trained within specific religious orders, occasionally employed a slightly altered verb form to indicate not simple past action, but rather an ongoing state, a condition that continued to exist rather than a single completed event. It was a subtle distinction, easily missed, but one that fundamentally changed the meaning of any sentence in which it appeared. Eleanor's breath caught as the full implication settled over her. If this final instance of the verb carried that altered meaning, then the entire passage was not, as previous translators had concluded, a philosophical discussion about the unreliable nature of memory as a fixed, singular event. It was instead a meditation on memory as a continuous, ongoing process, one that never fully settled into fixed truth, but remained perpetually shaped and reshaped by the person recalling it. The distinction, though subtle in wording, changed the entire meaning of the ancient scribe's intended argument. Where the Duke's earlier translation suggested memory as something flawed and static, prone to occasional error, Eleanor's emerging understanding suggested something far more dynamic. The original author, whoever they had been, was arguing that memory was never truly finished, never a settled record of the past, but rather a living thing, constantly reshaped by the present moment in which it was recalled. She sat back in her chair, momentarily stunned by the elegance of the realization, feeling something close to reverence for whichever ancient scribe had first crafted such a nuanced philosophical argument, buried for centuries beneath layers of misunderstanding and hurried translation. She began working quickly now, her earlier caution giving way to focused urgency, rewriting each line of her translation with the new understanding fully integrated. Sentence by sentence, the passage began to take clearer shape beneath her quill, the previously confusing final section resolving into something coherent, even beautiful in its philosophical implications. As she wrote, she found herself recalling another lesson her father had taught her, one she had nearly forgotten until this very moment. He had once told her that translation was not simply the mechanical replacement of one word with another, but an act of listening, of allowing an ancient voice to speak clearly through the fog of centuries, without imposing modern assumptions upon meanings the original author never intended. She had dismissed the advice as somewhat poetic at the time, more philosophy than practical instruction, but now, working through the final delicate turns of this stubborn passage, she understood exactly what he had meant. The manuscript was not simply a puzzle to be solved through grammatical precision alone. It required a kind of patience that honored the original author's intention, a willingness to sit with uncertainty until the true shape of their argument revealed itself naturally, rather than forcing an answer before it was ready to emerge. She continued working steadily through the remaining lines, cross-referencing several additional reference texts to confirm her growing confidence in the revised interpretation. Each new piece of evidence she uncovered supported the same conclusion, strengthening her certainty with every passing minute. By the time she reached the final line of the passage, she felt a quiet, settled confidence she had not expected to feel when she first sat down at the desk. She read through her completed translation one final time, checking each sentence carefully against the original Latin, searching for any remaining inconsistency or weakness in her reasoning. She found none. The passage now read clearly, coherently, its philosophical argument fully intact, and she believed far more faithful to the original scribe's intention than any previous attempt had managed to capture. A soft knock sounded at the study room door, interrupting her final review. She looked up as the door opened slightly, revealing Professor Bennington's kind, weathered face peering in with quiet concern. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "it has been nearly 2 hours. I do not wish to rush you, but I thought I should check whether you required anything further, more candles, perhaps, or refreshment." Eleanor glanced toward the tall window, surprised to see the moon had shifted considerably higher in the night sky since she had first sat down. She had lost all track of time entirely, fully absorbed in the quiet, demanding work before her. "I believe I have finished, Professor," she said, setting down her quill carefully, flexing fingers that had grown stiff from hours of steady writing. Bennington's eyebrows lifted with genuine surprise, though a small, hopeful smile began forming at the corner of his mouth. "Finished, truly. The passage has resisted scholars for decades, Miss Whitmore. I do not say this to discourage you, only to ensure you have not rushed toward an incomplete conclusion in the interest of time. I have checked my work carefully, Alina said, gathering the pages of her translation neatly together. I believe the difficulty previous scholars encountered stemmed from a single overlooked grammatical variation, easy to miss, but significant once identified. I would welcome the chance to explain my reasoning fully, so that others may judge the strength of my evidence rather than simply my conclusion. Bennington studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and quietly impressed passing behind his eyes. Your father, he said finally, always did have a gift for noticing what others overlooked. It seems he passed that particular talent along rather thoroughly. Alina felt warmth rise in her chest at the comparison, though she said nothing, simply nodding her thanks as she rose from the desk, gathering her translated pages carefully in hand. Bennington held the door open for her, and together they stepped back into the wide, brightly lit hall, where the gathered crowd of scholars turned immediately toward them, conversation dying away into expectant silence. The Duke stood near the center of the room, his earlier confident posture now carrying a faint tension he did not entirely manage to hide. His eyes moved quickly to the pages in Alina's hand, then back to her calm, steady expression, searching for some sign of the failure he had so confidently predicted. Well, he said, his voice carrying a note of forced lightness across the quiet hall, it seems our young scholar has emerged. I trust 2 hours proved sufficient time to arrive at some conclusion, even if that conclusion ultimately mirrors what has already been established. Alina met his gaze steadily, feeling none of the earlier nervousness that had gripped her upon first entering the palace halls. Something had shifted within her during those quiet hours in the study room, a settled confidence born not from arrogance, but from the simple, solid knowledge that she had done careful, honest work she was fully prepared to defend before anyone willing to examine it fairly. I would be glad to share my findings, Your Grace, she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the hushed hall. Though I believe you may find they differ somewhat from the conclusions previously accepted. A fresh murmur of anticipation rippled through the gathered crowd, scholars leaning forward slightly, sensing that whatever Alina was about to reveal would prove far more significant than a simple confirmation of existing scholarship. Professor Caldwell, still standing near the edge of the group in her burgundy robes, exchanged a quick, curious glance with a colleague beside her. Even the Duke's practiced composure flickered visibly now, curiosity and unease mixing openly across his features as he waited to hear exactly what she had found. Professor Bennington gestured toward a small wooden stand near the center of the hall, the kind typically used for formal readings during academic gatherings. Perhaps, he suggested, addressing the room at large, Miss Whitmore should present her translation properly, with the opportunity for questions afterward. If her conclusions differ from prior scholarship, the assembly deserves a full and fair hearing of her reasoning. A general murmur of agreement passed through the crowd, and Alina stepped toward the stand, arranging her pages carefully before her. She glanced briefly toward the doorway of the study room, half expecting the nervous flutter in her chest to return now that dozens of eyes had settled fully upon her. But instead she found only steady calm, the same quiet focus that had carried her through the long hours of translation. Before I share my conclusions, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, I would like to walk through my reasoning so that anyone present may judge the evidence for themselves, rather than simply accepting my word. The Duke crossed his arms, leaning slightly against a nearby pillar, his expression carefully arranged into polite skepticism, though the tightness around his eyes suggested genuine attention beneath the practiced composure. By all means, he said. Scholarship should always withstand scrutiny. Alina nodded and began explaining her process, describing first the passage's opening sections, which she confirmed aligned closely with the Duke's earlier published interpretation regarding the general theme of memory and its philosophical treatment among ancient thinkers. Several scholars nodded along, familiar with the accepted reading, and the Duke's posture relaxed slightly, apparently reassured that her conclusions might ultimately align with his own after all. But as Alina moved deeper into her explanation, describing the peculiar repeated verb and its subtle variation in the passage's final line, the room's attention sharpened considerably. She held up her translated pages, pointing carefully to the specific word in question, and described the grammatical footnote she had discovered within the reference text, the documented variation used among certain monastic scribes to indicate ongoing, continuous states rather than fixed, completed events. If this reading is correct, Alina continued, then the passage does not describe memory as simply flawed or occasionally mistaken, as previously understood. It describes memory as a living, ongoing process, one that never settles into permanent truth, but continues shifting and reshaping itself each time it is recalled. A ripple of murmured discussion spread through the hall, some scholars nodding thoughtfully, clearly intrigued by the elegance of the reinterpretation, while others exchanged skeptical glances, waiting to hear how the Duke might respond to such a direct challenge to his earlier published work. The Duke straightened from his relaxed posture against the pillar, his expression cooling considerably. "An interesting theory," he said, though his tone carried clear doubt. "However, I find it difficult to accept that such a significant grammatical distinction would have escaped the notice of every scholar who examined this passage before you, myself included. Perhaps you have simply misread a common scribal error as intentional variation." "That was my initial concern as well," Alina replied evenly, refusing to let his dismissive tone unsettle her steady delivery. "Which is why I did not rely solely on my own judgment. I cross-referenced the variation against several documented examples from the same historical period and scribal tradition." She gestured toward the reference volume she had carried with her from the study room, setting it upon a nearby table and opening it to the relevant footnote. "The pattern is documented here, attributed to scribes trained within a specific monastic order active during roughly the same period this manuscript is believed to have been copied. It is not common knowledge, I admit, tucked away as it is within a fairly obscure footnote, but it is documented, verifiable, and consistent with the variation found in this particular passage." Several scholars stepped closer to examine the reference text for themselves, murmuring quietly among each other as they confirmed the footnote's existence and content. Professor Caldwell, reading over the shoulder of a colleague, nodded slowly, her expression shifting from cautious curiosity toward genuine interest. "This is remarkable," Caldwell said, half to herself, half to the surrounding crowd. "I confess I was unaware of this particular scribal tradition myself, though the source appears sound." The Duke's jaw tightened visibly now, his earlier confidence beginning to waver under the weight of mounting evidence he had not anticipated encountering. "Even granting the existence of this obscure variation," he said, his voice carrying a sharper edge than before, "one instance within a single manuscript hardly constitutes definitive proof. Scribal errors happen. A single misplaced letter could easily explain the discrepancy, without requiring such an elaborate reinterpretation of the entire passage's meaning." Alina considered his objection carefully before responding, unwilling to dismiss a fair challenge simply because it came from someone determined to see her fail. "That is a reasonable concern, Your Grace," she said, "which is why I examined the physical characteristics of the letter itself as well, not simply its grammatical implications." She turned back toward the glass-encased manuscript, still resting upon its velvet-lined stand nearby, and gestured toward the specific line in question. "If this were a simple scribal slip, we might expect to see signs of hesitation or correction in the ink, common when a scribe catches their own error mid-stroke. Instead, the letter is formed with the same confident, consistent hand found throughout the rest of the passage. There is no hesitation, no correction, no indication of accidental error. The scribe wrote this final instance deliberately, in the same steady hand as every other word on the page." A hush fell over the gathered crowd as several scholars leaned in to examine the manuscript more closely, comparing the formation of the letters with careful, practiced eyes. Even the Duke stepped forward, unable to resist the pull of genuine scholarly curiosity despite his mounting discomfort, studying the ink strokes with narrowed, focused attention. The silence stretched several long moments as the assembled scholars examined the evidence for themselves, murmuring quietly amongst each other, some nodding in growing agreement, others still withholding judgment until they had studied the matter more thoroughly. Alina stood quietly at the reading stand, allowing the evidence to speak for itself rather than pressing her case further, trusting the careful patience her father had instilled in her many years earlier. Finally, an elderly scholar near the back of the crowd, a man Alina did not recognize but who clearly commanded respect among the gathered assembly given the way others deferred toward him, cleared his throat and spoke for the first time that evening. "I have studied manuscripts from this period for over 30 years, he said, his voice carrying a rasping authority that immediately quieted the surrounding murmurs. "I have never before encountered this specific footnote regarding continuous verb variation, though I confess the underlying scholarship, once explained, strikes me as entirely sound. The physical evidence upon the manuscript itself further supports Miss Whitmore's conclusion far more convincingly than I would have expected possible from such a subtle grammatical distinction." The Duke's expression tightened further at the elderly scholar's endorsement, clearly aware that the tide of opinion within the hall was shifting steadily away from his earlier confident dismissal. He glanced briefly toward Alina, something calculating flickering behind his eyes, as though searching desperately for some remaining angle of attack. "Even if we accept this grammatical distinction as valid," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "it remains only one small detail within a much larger passage. It hardly proves Miss Whitmore possesses a comprehensive understanding of Latin sufficient to overturn established scholarship entirely." Alina met his gaze steadily, feeling something settle firmly within her chest, a quiet resolve that had grown steadily throughout the long evening. "Then perhaps," she said, "it would be best if I simply read the completed translation aloud in its entirety, so that this assembly may judge for themselves whether the understanding demonstrated throughout is comprehensive, or merely fortunate in a single isolated detail." A fresh wave of anticipation rippled through the hall at her proposal, scholars exchanging eager glances, sensing that the evening's true climax had finally arrived. Professor Bennington stepped forward once more, gesturing toward the reading stand with quiet encouragement. "I believe that would settle the matter quite thoroughly," he said. "Miss Whitmore, please, whenever you are ready." Alina drew a steady breath, gathering her translated pages firmly in hand, feeling the weight of the entire hall's attention settle fully upon her one final time. She thought briefly of her father, of countless quiet evenings spent bent over old books together, of his patient voice guiding her through difficult passages until understanding finally bloomed. She thought of every door that had ever been quietly closed against her, every dismissive glance she had learned to absorb without flinching. Then she looked up, met the Duke's tense, watchful gaze directly, and began to read. Her voice, steady and clear, filled the hall as she read through the opening lines of her translation, the familiar philosophical framing of memory and its uncertain nature unfolding, just as the earlier accepted scholarship had described. Several scholars nodded along, recognizing the shared ground between her work and the version long attributed to the Duke, and for a moment, a few faces in the crowd relaxed, perhaps assuming the evening's tension had been overstated after all. But as Alina continued deeper into the passage, her reading shifted subtly, the language of her translation curving away from the familiar interpretation toward something new, something the hall had not yet heard given voice. She read through the section describing memory not as a fixed record subject to occasional flaw, but as a living process, endlessly reshaped by each act of recollection, forever incomplete, forever in motion. The hall grew quieter with each line, the earlier restless murmuring fading into complete, focused silence. Even the servants stationed along the walls seemed to lean subtly forward, drawn into the unfolding revelation despite having no particular stake in matters of ancient grammar. Alina reached the passage's final section, the portion containing the disputed verb variation she had spent the evening's quiet hours carefully unraveling. She read slowly here, deliberately, allowing each word its proper weight, honoring the ancient scribe's careful construction rather than rushing toward the conclusion. "The mind does not hold the past as a vessel holds water," she read, her voice carrying the ancient author's meaning with quiet reverence, "but rather as a river holds its course, ever present, ever moving, shaped anew by each bank it touches along its journey. What we call memory is not a thing recovered, but a thing continuously made." She lowered the pages slightly, allowing the final words to settle over the silent hall. For a long moment, no one spoke. The candles flickered gently along the walls, their soft light the only movement within the otherwise motionless room. Then Professor Caldwell broke the silence, her voice hushed with genuine wonder. "That is beautiful," she said softly, almost to herself, "and it changes everything about how this text has been understood for decades." A ripple of quiet agreement spread through the gathered scholars, murmured exclamations of surprise and admiration passing from one small cluster to the next. The elderly scholar who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, a faint, approving smile crossing his weathered features. "In 30 years of study," he said, loudly enough for the whole hall to hear, "I have rarely witnessed such a precise, elegant correction to established scholarship. Miss Whitmore has not merely offered an alternative interpretation. She has revealed the passage's true intended meaning, hidden beneath layers of prior misunderstanding." Alina felt warmth rise through her chest at the praise, though she remained composed, aware that the evening's true test still awaited its final verdict. She turned slowly toward the Duke, who stood motionless near the center of the hall, his earlier confident posture now completely abandoned. His face had gone pale, his arms no longer crossed with casual authority, but hanging loosely at his sides, as though the weight of what he had just heard had drained something essential from his usual commanding presence. He said nothing. Professor Bennington cleared his throat gently, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the hall following the elderly scholar's praise. "Your Grace," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though something firm lingered beneath the surface courtesy. "Your own published translation, if I recall correctly, rendered this same passage as a simple caution against trusting memory too fully, framing it as evidence of the mind's inherent unreliability rather than as this more nuanced meditation on memory's ongoing, living nature." The Duke's throat worked visibly as he swallowed, his eyes fixed on the ancient manuscript still resting within its glass case nearby, as though seeing it now for the first time despite having studied it years earlier. He began, then stopped, his usual eloquence apparently deserting him entirely. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, the entire hall watching the once confident Duke struggle to find words adequate to the moment. Alina did not press him further, did not allow triumph to creep into her expression, though she felt something quietly settle within her chest, a vindication she had not fully expected to feel so completely. A younger scholar near the front of the crowd, apparently unable to contain his curiosity any longer, spoke up hesitantly. "Your Grace, does this mean your original translation, the one currently taught within the palace's own scholarly curriculum, contains a fundamental error?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable, forcing the Duke to confront directly what everyone in the hall had already silently concluded. His jaw tightened, color slowly returning to his face, though not the confident flush of earlier arrogance. This was something closer to genuine discomfort, the particular sting of a man forced to publicly reckon with a mistake he had never imagined making. "It would appear," the Duke said finally, his voice noticeably quieter than before, stripped of its earlier theatrical confidence, "that Miss Whitmore's reading identifies a nuance I did not fully appreciate during my own examination of this passage." It was not, Alina noted, a full admission. The careful phrasing left considerable room for the Duke to preserve some measure of dignity, framing her discovery as an added nuance rather than an outright correction of clear error. She understood the impulse, even as she recognized it for the small evasion it was. Pride did not surrender easily, even when confronted with undeniable evidence. Professor Bennington, however, seemed unwilling to let the matter rest quite so gently. "With respect, Your Grace," he said, his tone still carefully measured but unmistakably firm, "the distinction Miss Whitmore has identified does not simply add nuance to your original translation. It fundamentally alters the passage's meaning. Your version suggests the ancient author distrusted memory entirely, viewing it as a flawed and unreliable faculty prone to error. Miss Whitmore's translation suggests something nearly the opposite, that memory's fluid, ever-changing nature was not viewed as a flaw at all, but as an essential, even beautiful, characteristic of human consciousness. These are not small differences. They represent entirely different philosophical conclusions." The hall remained silent as Bennington's words settled over the gathered crowd, several scholars nodding slowly in quiet agreement, recognizing the truth of his assessment. The Duke's earlier pallor returned, his eyes drifting once more toward the ancient manuscript, as though searching its faded ink for some escape from the conclusion now unavoidably before him. Elinor watched him carefully, aware that this moment carried significance far beyond a single evening's academic disagreement. Whatever the Duke said next, whatever he chose to acknowledge or continue resisting, would shape not only how tonight's demonstration was remembered, but how she herself would be regarded within these halls going forward. The silence stretched on, minute after minute, no one within the hall willing to break the tension gripping the room. Servants along the walls stood motionless, candles burning steadily down toward their bases, the night growing later around them while the assembled scholars waited, transfixed, for the Duke's response. Finally, after what felt to Elinor like an impossibly long stretch of silence, the Duke lifted his gaze from the manuscript and looked directly at her, something unreadable passing across his features, no longer arrogance, though not yet full humility either. Something suspended uncertainly between the two. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort, "your translation is correct, more than correct. It is superior to my own published work in every meaningful respect." A collective murmur swept through the hall, surprise and satisfaction mingling audibly among the gathered scholars. Professor Caldwell exchanged a quick, delighted glance with a colleague beside her. The elderly scholar near the back nodded with evident approval, folding his weathered hands together with quiet satisfaction. Elinor said nothing immediately, allowing the moment its full weight before responding. She had not expected, walking into this palace hall only hours earlier, that she would stand here now, having corrected the standing scholarship of a man who had mocked her so openly upon their very first meeting. Yet here she stood, and the evidence, careful and undeniable, spoke entirely for itself. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice calm and steady, carrying no trace of triumph or bitterness, only quiet, settled dignity. "I did not undertake this translation to prove you wrong. I undertook it because the passage deserved a careful reading, and because my father taught me that every text, however difficult, eventually yields its truth to a patient enough reader." The mention of her father seemed to land with particular weight across the hall, several older scholars nodding with recognition, remembering perhaps the quiet, dedicated historian who had once moved among their own ranks decades earlier, never wealthy, never celebrated, but respected nonetheless by those who had known him well. The Duke lowered his eyes briefly, something that might have been genuine humility flickering across his expression before he composed himself once more. "Your father," he said quietly, "would be proud, I think, to see the scholar his daughter has become." The hall remained hushed, the weight of the evening's revelation settling fully over everyone present, no one quite ready yet to break the profound stillness that had descended following the Duke's grudging, hard-won acknowledgment. Word of the evening's events did not remain confined to the symposium hall for long. By the following morning, whispers had already begun spreading through the palace corridors, carried by servants who had witnessed the exchange, by scholars eager to describe the remarkable turn of events to colleagues who had missed the gathering, and by the Duke's own attendants, who found themselves fielding curious questions from every direction. Elinor returned home that night exhausted but strangely light, as though a weight she had carried unknowingly for years had finally lifted from her shoulders. Margaret was waiting when she arrived, having refused to sleep until she heard how the evening had unfolded, and Alina found herself recounting the entire event in careful detail, watching her friend's expression shift from anxious concern to open astonishment as the story progressed. "He admitted you were right," Margaret said, still shaking her head in disbelief, "in front of the whole hall." "He did," Alina confirmed, allowing herself a small, tired smile. "Though I suspect the matter is not fully settled yet. A promise made in the heat of a public wager is one thing. Formal recognition within the palace's scholarly ranks is another matter entirely." Margaret's brow furrowed. Surely a duke's word carries weight enough. "A duke's word carries weight when it aligns with what those around him already wish to believe," Alina said quietly. "I am not certain everyone within those halls wished to see me succeed, regardless of what evidence I presented." Her caution proved well-founded. Within days, a formal letter arrived at her small house, summoning her back to the palace to appear before the Royal Chancellor's Council, the body responsible for approving any formal recognition or appointment within the palace's scholarly ranks. The letter's tone was polite but carefully noncommittal, offering no indication of whether the council intended to honor the Duke's public promise or challenge it entirely. Alina arrived at the appointed hour to find a far smaller, more formal gathering than the symposium's grand hall had hosted. A long table stretched across a narrow chamber, behind which sat 5 council members dressed in official robes, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open skepticism. At the center sat an older man with a stern, angular face, introduced simply as Chancellor Whitfield, whose authority within the palace's administrative structure, Alina quickly gathered, extended well beyond matters of scholarship alone. Professor Bennington stood near the side of the chamber, along with Professor Caldwell and, somewhat unexpectedly, the Duke himself, dressed formally, his expression carefully composed though noticeably more subdued than the confident bearing he had displayed during their first encounter. Chancellor Whitfield studied Alina for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the flat, measured tone of a man accustomed to weighing decisions carefully before committing to them. "Miss Whitmore, we have received reports of your performance during the recent symposium, along with His Grace's public acknowledgement of your work's merit. However, this council must consider matters beyond a single evening's demonstration before approving formal recognition within the palace's scholarly community." "I understand, Chancellor," Alina said, keeping her voice steady despite the weight of 5 unfamiliar, evaluating gazes settled upon her. "Formal scholarly appointment within these halls," the Chancellor continued, "has historically required extensive documented education. Typically through recognized institutions, this council trusts to maintain rigorous standards. Your education, as I understand it, came entirely through private instruction from your father, followed by considerable self-study. While I do not doubt the sincerity of your effort, this council must consider whether informal education, however impressive its results in isolated demonstration, provides sufficient foundation for lasting scholarly contribution." Alina felt a familiar tightness rise in her chest, the old, wearily familiar sensation of being measured not by what she had actually accomplished, but by the shape of the path that had led her there. She had expected resistance, had braced herself for exactly this kind of careful, institutional doubt, yet feeling it directed at her so plainly still stung more than she had anticipated. Before she could respond, Professor Bennington stepped forward. "Chancellor, if I may. I have known many scholars educated through the most prestigious institutions this kingdom offers, myself included among them. I can say with confidence that Miss Whitmore's demonstrated skill during the symposium exceeded the ability of most graduates I have encountered in my many years of teaching. The methodology she employed, the careful cross-referencing of obscure scholarly sources, the close physical examination of the manuscript itself, these are not signs of fortunate guesswork. They are the marks of rigorous, disciplined training, regardless of where that training took place. Chancellor Whitfield's expression remained carefully neutral, though he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it fully. Your testimony carries weight, Professor Bennington, as does yours, Professor Caldwell, should you wish to add your own observations. However, this council must also consider precedent. Formal recognition of a scholar educated entirely outside recognized institutions would establish a pathway others might seek to follow, potentially undermining the standards this council has long worked to maintain. Alina understood, listening carefully to the Chancellor's careful phrasing, that the true concern extended beyond her individual case entirely. It was not merely a question of her own qualification, but a fear of the precedent her acceptance might set. A crack in a carefully maintained wall that had long kept certain doors closed to anyone who did not fit a familiar, expected mold. She drew a steadying breath and spoke before anyone else could fill the silence. Chancellor, if I may address your concern directly, you worry that recognizing my work might open a pathway others could exploit without possessing genuine skill or discipline. I would respectfully suggest that the solution to that concern is not to close the door on informal education entirely, but simply to maintain the same rigorous standard of evidence you would demand from any scholar, regardless of their background. Judge each individual's work on its own merit. If a self-taught scholar's translation proves flawed under close examination, reject it. If it withstands the same scrutiny you would apply to a graduate of your most respected institutions, as mine did before this very palace's assembled scholars only days ago, then surely the source of that scholar's education becomes secondary to the quality of the work itself. A brief silence followed her words, several of the council members exchanging quiet glances. The Duke, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying less of its former theatrical confidence and something closer to genuine consideration. Chancellor, if I may offer my own perspective, given my direct involvement in this matter. I entered that symposium fully expecting Miss Whitmore's claims to collapse under scrutiny. I confess I hoped in the moment to demonstrate rather publicly the folly of informal education against rigorous institutional training. Instead, I found myself the one instructed, my own published scholarship corrected through evidence I could not honestly dispute. He paused, glancing briefly toward Alina before continuing. I do not say this easily, Chancellor, as pride is not a trait I surrender without considerable discomfort. But I believe this council does the palace's scholarly reputation a disservice if it allows administrative caution to reject work of genuine, demonstrated merit, simply because it arrived through an unconventional path. The Chancellor's stern expression shifted slightly at the Duke's unexpected testimony, something calculating passing behind his eyes as he weighed the political weight of a Duke's public endorsement against the council's traditional caution. Professor Caldwell, seizing the momentary shift in the room's atmosphere, added her own voice to the growing chorus of support. Chancellor, I would add that several other scholars present during the symposium, including Master Ellery, whose reputation within this kingdom's academic circles requires no introduction, expressed similar admiration for Miss Whitmore's methodology. I believe you would find, should you inquire further, that the consensus among those who actually witnessed her work extends well beyond polite courtesy. The Chancellor sat quietly for a long moment, his fingers steepled thoughtfully before him, clearly weighing the mounting testimony against whatever institutional caution had shaped his initial hesitation. Alina waited, her hands clasped tightly together beneath the table's edge, outwardly composed but inwardly bracing for whatever verdict emerged from the lengthening silence. Finally, the Chancellor spoke. This council will not overturn long-standing precedent based on a single evening's demonstration alone, regardless of how impressive that demonstration proved to be. However, he continued, raising a hand slightly as Alina felt her stomach drop at his opening words, given the substantial testimony offered here today, this council will grant Miss Whitmore a provisional scholarly appointment, subject to a formal review period of 6 months, during which her continued work will be evaluated by a panel including Professor Bennington and Professor Caldwell. Should her work continue to demonstrate the standard witnessed during the symposium, full and permanent recognition will follow without further obstruction. It was not the immediate, unconditional acceptance Alina might have hoped for, but it was, she understood clearly, a door opened rather than closed, an opportunity to prove herself further rather than a final rejection built upon assumptions she had spent her entire life quietly fighting against. She inclined her head respectfully toward the council. "Thank you, Chancellor. I accept these terms gladly, and I will do everything within my ability to demonstrate that your council's trust is well placed." As the meeting concluded and the council members rose to depart, the Duke lingered near the chamber's doorway, waiting until most of the others had filed out before approaching Alina directly. His expression carried none of the earlier arrogance, replaced instead by something more thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I owe you a more complete apology than I offered during the symposium itself. My conduct that evening was unbecoming of someone who claims to value scholarship above personal pride. I hope, in time, I might have the opportunity to demonstrate that my respect for your ability is genuine, rather than simply the reluctant concession of a man caught in his own mistaken assumptions." Alina studied him for a moment, weighing his words carefully before responding. She did not fully trust the sudden transformation, was not yet certain whether it reflected genuine change or simply careful political recalculation following a public embarrassment. Yet something in his tone, quieter and more uncertain than she had yet heard from him, suggested at least the beginning of something real. "Apology accepted, Your Grace," she said finally. "Though I would suggest the truest demonstration of changed respect lies not in words spoken quietly in an empty chamber, but in how you conduct yourself when the next young scholar arrives at your door, carrying knowledge earned through paths you did not expect." The Duke's mouth curved into something that was not quite his old confident smirk, but rather a small, genuine smile, touched with something like humility. "A fair correction," he said. "It seems I have more still to learn from you, Miss Whitmore." The weeks following the council's decision brought changes to Alina's life more sweeping than she had ever imagined possible. Word of her provisional appointment spread quickly through the city, carried first by the palace's own staff, then by merchants and neighbors who had known her only as the quiet daughter of a modest historian, and finally by broadsheets that found the story too remarkable to ignore. A woman, self-taught, correcting a duke's published scholarship before an assembly of the kingdom's finest minds, made for compelling reading, and within a month, Alina found herself recognized in places she had never expected, greeted with curious glances and occasional whispered questions whenever she walked through the market square. Margaret found the sudden attention endlessly amusing, teasing Alina gently whenever a passing stranger paused to stare a moment too long. "You have become something of a legend," she said one afternoon, as they walked together toward the tailor's shop to collect a new gown Alina had finally been able to afford, thanks to the modest stipend accompanying her provisional appointment. "The girl who humbled a duke with nothing but an old book and a sharp mind." "I did not set out to humble anyone," Alina said, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite her protest. "I only wanted to read what was written honestly." "Perhaps," Margaret said, "but sometimes honesty humbles people all on its own, without needing any help." The provisional appointment came with genuine responsibility, far more demanding than Alina had anticipated during the brief, tense meeting before the Chancellor's Council. She was assigned a small office within the palace's scholarly wing, modest compared to the grand chambers occupied by more established professors, but hers alone, filled with shelves, she slowly began populating with reference texts borrowed from the royal archive. Professor Bennington visited often during those early weeks, offering guidance without ever making her feel as though she required constant supervision, treating her instead as a capable colleague, still becoming familiar with the palace's particular rhythms and expectations. Professor Caldwell, too, became something of an unexpected mentor, inviting Alina to observe several of her own lectures on ancient historical texts. quietly pointing out useful techniques for engaging skeptical audiences and defending careful scholarship against those inclined toward easy dismissal. "You will find," Caldwell told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace's quiet library corridors, "that not everyone within these halls will welcome you as warmly as Bennington and I have. Some will resent the attention your story has drawn. Others will simply distrust anything unfamiliar, regardless of its merit. Do not let their coldness convince you that your place here is any less earned than theirs." Alina took the warning seriously and found it proven true soon enough. Not every scholar within the palace greeted her arrival with enthusiasm. Several older professors treated her with polite but distant formality, clearly withholding full judgment until her provisional period concluded, unwilling to invest genuine warmth in someone whose position remained, in their eyes, still unproven. A few younger scholars, threatened perhaps by the swift attention her story had garnered, made pointed comments within her hearing about fortunate circumstance and manufactured spectacle, suggesting her success owed more to the symposium's dramatic staging than to any genuine, sustainable skill. Alina absorbed these quiet slights with the same steady composure she had carried into the symposium hall on that first tense evening, refusing to let resentment or doubt shake her focus from the work itself. She dedicated herself fully to her assigned research, a project examining several additional fragments recovered alongside the manuscript that had first brought her into the palace's attention, tracing their possible origins and cross-referencing them against related historical records scattered throughout the royal archive. The work proved slow and demanding, requiring the same patient, careful attention she had learned at her father's kitchen table many years earlier. There were days when entire afternoons passed without meaningful progress, when a single stubborn phrase resisted every attempt at clear translation, leaving her frustrated and doubting herself despite the symposium's earlier triumph. During those difficult stretches, she often found herself returning to her father's old notebooks, rereading his careful, patient notes, drawing quiet strength from the memory of his own persistent dedication despite decades spent largely unrecognized by the very institution now cautiously testing his daughter's worth. The Duke, true to the quiet promise offered during their private conversation following the council meeting, began seeking her out occasionally within the palace's scholarly wing, though never with the theatrical confidence that had marked their first meeting. Their conversations, initially stiff and cautious on both sides, gradually softened into something resembling genuine collegial exchange. He asked one afternoon whether she might review a portion of his own ongoing research, a request that would have seemed unthinkable only months earlier, and Alina found herself surprised by the humility with which he received her careful, honest feedback. "You were right to question my earlier translation," he admitted during one such exchange, several weeks into her provisional appointment. "I have been reconsidering several other passages I once accepted without sufficient scrutiny. It seems confidence and correctness are not always the same thing, however much I once assumed otherwise." Alina found herself softening toward him gradually, not forgetting the sting of his earlier public mockery, but recognizing genuine effort in his evolving humility. She did not offer easy forgiveness, understanding that trust, once damaged, required more than a few weeks of altered behavior to fully rebuild. But she allowed room for the possibility that people, even proud ones, could genuinely change when confronted honestly with their own mistaken assumptions. As the months passed, Alina's reputation within the palace continued growing steadily, built not upon the singular drama of her first public triumph, but upon the accumulated weight of careful, consistent work. She published a short paper detailing her findings regarding the additional manuscript fragments, circulated quietly among the palace's scholarly community before eventually reaching wider academic circles beyond the capital. The response proved largely positive, several respected scholars from neighboring regions writing to express admiration for her meticulous methodology, further strengthening the case for her eventual permanent appointment. Margaret, ever practical despite her evident pride in Alina's growing success, gently reminded her during one quiet evening together that the provisional period's conclusion approached quickly. 6 months seemed a long stretch when the council first announced it, Margaret observed, mending a torn hem while Alina reviewed a stack of research notes spread across their small kitchen table. Yet here we are, nearly at its end already. Alina glanced up from her notes, a flicker of old nervousness stirring briefly in her chest despite the months of steady progress behind her. I have done everything within my ability to prove myself worthy of permanent recognition, she said quietly. Whether the council agrees remains, I suppose, still uncertain. They would be foolish to doubt you now, Margaret said firmly, after everything you have accomplished these past months. Alina smiled faintly, though the old habit of caution, built through a lifetime of doors closed against her before she had ever been given the chance to prove herself, kept her from fully trusting in certainty just yet. She thought of her father often during those final weeks of her provisional period, wondering what he might have said, watching his daughter stand at the threshold of formal recognition, within halls that had never once opened their doors to him during his own lifetime of quiet, dedicated scholarship. She resolved, whatever the council's final decision, to carry his patient example forward, regardless of whether the palace's formal recognition ultimately followed. The work itself, she had come to understand deeply during these transformative months, held value independent of whatever titles or approvals others chose to grant it. Yet she could not deny, as the final week of her provisional period arrived, a quiet, hopeful anticipation building steadily within her chest, wondering what the council's ultimate judgment would finally bring. The final review took place in the same narrow chamber where Alina had first stood before Chancellor Whitfield and his council many months earlier, though this time the atmosphere carried a noticeably different quality. Professor Bennington and Professor Caldwell sat prepared with detailed reports documenting her research, her published paper, and the steady, consistent quality of her work throughout the provisional period. Several additional scholars, drawn by curiosity or genuine respect earned over the preceding months, had requested permission to observe the proceedings, filling the chamber's modest gallery with far more attendance than the council typically drew for such reviews. Chancellor Whitfield opened the proceedings with the same measured formality Alina remembered from their first meeting, though something in his expression carried less guarded skepticism than before. This council has received extensive documentation regarding Miss Whitmore's work over the past 6 months, he began, addressing the gathered assembly. Before rendering final judgment, we will hear brief testimony from those who have supervised her research. Professor Bennington rose first, offering a thorough account of Alina's research into the additional manuscript fragments, praising both the rigor of her methodology and the clarity of her written conclusions. Professor Caldwell followed, adding her own observations regarding Alina's growing skill in presenting complex scholarship to skeptical audiences. A skill Caldwell noted was often underestimated in importance despite its considerable value to the palace's broader academic mission. When the Chancellor turned toward the gathered assembly to ask whether any further testimony would be offered, the Duke rose from his seat near the chamber's rear, drawing surprised glances from several council members who had not expected his presence at what was, technically, a matter fully outside his own formal duties. "Chancellor, if the council will permit a brief statement," he said, his voice carrying the same measured seriousness Alina had come to recognize over their months of gradually warming acquaintance. "I opposed Miss Whitmore's presence within these halls when I first encountered her, dismissing her claims before she had ever been given fair opportunity to demonstrate them. I have spent these past months observing her work closely, both through the research she has pursued independently and through several collaborative discussions regarding my own ongoing scholarship. I can state, without reservation, that her contributions to this palace's academic community have proven substantial, rigorous, and entirely deserving of full and permanent recognition." A murmur passed through the gathered gallery at the Duke's unequivocal endorsement, several scholars exchanging surprised, approving glances. Chancellor Whitfield studied the Duke for a long moment, something almost approving crossing his own stern features before he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Your testimony is noted, Your Grace, and carries considerable weight given your own initial skepticism regarding this matter." He turned his attention toward Alina, who stood quietly near the center of the chamber, her hands folded calmly before her despite the anticipation building steadily beneath her composed exterior. "Miss Whitmore, this council has reviewed your work thoroughly over these past months. Your research has proven consistently rigorous, your published paper well received among respected scholars both within this palace and beyond. This council finds no remaining basis upon which to withhold formal recognition." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle fully over the chamber before continuing. "It is therefore the decision of this council that Miss Alina Whitmore be granted full and permanent appointment as a recognized scholar within the palace's academic community. With all rights, privileges, and responsibilities such appointment traditionally carries." The chamber erupted into soft applause, scholars in the gallery rising from their seats to offer their approval, Professor Bennington's weathered face breaking into a wide, genuine smile as he clasped Professor Caldwell's hand warmly beside him. Alina felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, months of quiet, patient effort finally arriving at the recognition she had worked so carefully to earn, not through singular dramatic triumph alone, but through steady, sustained dedication proven over time. Chancellor Whitfield rose from his seat, extending a formal hand toward Alina, a gesture she understood carried significant weight given the careful, guarded formality he had maintained throughout their earlier acquaintance. "Congratulations, Professor Whitmore," he said, using her new formal title for the first time. "This palace's scholarly community is fortunate to count you among its ranks." Alina accepted his hand with quiet, deeply felt gratitude, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her chest. "Thank you, Chancellor. I will continue working to ensure this council's trust remains well placed." As the formal proceedings concluded, and the gathered assembly began filing from the chamber, offering scattered congratulations along the way, the Duke approached Alina directly, his expression carrying genuine warmth she would not have believed possible from their first tense encounter so many months earlier. "Professor Whitmore," he said, testing the title with evident satisfaction, "it suits you well." "Thank you, Your Grace," Alina replied, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "Though I confess I still remember rather vividly the first time we spoke, and the confidence with which you assured this hall I could not read Latin." The Duke winced slightly, though good humor lingered beneath his evident embarrassment. "A mistake I suspect I shall be reminded of for many years to come, and rightfully so. Though I hope, in time, our shared work together might come to define our acquaintance rather more than that single unfortunate evening." "I believe it already has," Alina said gently, and found she meant it fully. The Duke's journey from arrogant dismissal toward genuine, hard-won respect had unfolded slowly across many months, built through consistent effort rather than a single dramatic reversal, and she had come to value the steady evolution of his character nearly as much as her own formal recognition. That evening, Alina returned home to find Margaret waiting with a small, carefully prepared celebration, simple but heartfelt, a modest cake she had saved carefully for weeks to afford, and a bottle of wine borrowed from a neighboring shopkeeper who had heard the day's news and insisted on contributing something toward the occasion. "Professor Whitmore," Margaret said, raising a modest glass with evident pride, "your father would be so proud of you today." Alina felt her throat tighten with emotion, thinking of her father's quiet, patient guidance through so many long evenings of study, of his firm belief that knowledge belonged to whoever sought it earnestly enough, regardless of what doors the wider world chose to keep closed. She lifted her own glass in response, her voice steady despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "He always told me that no one could close the door inside my own mind," she said softly. "I only wish he could have lived to see it finally opened elsewhere as well." Margaret reached across the small table, squeezing Alina's hand warmly. "Perhaps he does see it, in whatever way such things are seen, and even if he does not, you have carried his teaching forward exactly as he hoped you would. That much, at least, is certain. Alina sat quietly for a long moment afterward, looking around the small, familiar kitchen where so much of her education had unfolded years earlier, candlelight flickering gently against walls lined still with her father's treasured books. She thought of the young girl who had once stumbled awkwardly through unfamiliar Latin syllables at this very table, uncertain whether such quiet, patient effort would ever amount to anything the wider world might recognize. That girl, she realized with quiet, settled satisfaction, had finally found her place, not through fortune or favor, but through the same patient, careful diligence her father had instilled in her from the very beginning. The palace halls that had once seemed impossibly distant now stood open before her, not because anyone had simply granted her passage, but because she had proven, through careful and undeniable evidence, that she belonged there all along. Years passed, and the small office Alina had once occupied within the palace's scholarly wing gradually grew into something far larger, both in space and in purpose. Her research into ancient manuscripts continued steadily, earning her a respected reputation not only within the palace, but among scholars from distant kingdoms who wrote seeking her opinion on difficult, disputed texts. Yet it was not her research alone that came to define her legacy within those halls, but rather the doors she worked patiently to open for others who followed after her. She remembered clearly, even years later, the particular sting of standing before Chancellor Whitfield's council, forced to defend not simply her scholarship, but her very right to be considered a scholar at all, based on nothing more than the unconventional path that had led her there. She resolved, once her position within the palace grew secure enough to carry real influence, that no young woman with genuine talent and dedication should face that same lonely, uphill struggle without support. It began modestly, a single young girl from a merchant family who approached Alina after hearing the now well-known story of her symposium triumph, asking hesitantly whether she might be permitted to observe one of Alina's research sessions. Alina remembered her own younger self in the girl's nervous, hopeful expression, and agreed without hesitation. Within a year, that single arrangement had grown into a small, informal gathering of several young women, meeting regularly within Alina's office to study alongside her, working through difficult passages together in the same patient, careful manner her father had once taught her. Professor Bennington, now considerably grayer but no less warm in spirit, often stopped by these gatherings, offering guidance and gentle encouragement to the growing circle of young scholars. Professor Caldwell, too, became a frequent presence, eventually taking on several of the young women as formal students once the palace's evolving attitudes made such arrangements increasingly possible. The Duke, whose own scholarship had grown steadily more careful and rigorous under the influence of his ongoing collaboration with Alina, eventually proposed a formal measure before the palace's governing council, suggesting that promising students demonstrating sufficient skill, regardless of their prior educational background, be granted formal pathways toward palace apprenticeship. The proposal met with predictable resistance from more traditional voices within the council, but Alina's own steady, undeniable success over the intervening years lent the measure considerable weight, and after extensive debate, it eventually passed, establishing a formal precedent that would quietly reshape the palace's scholarly community for generations to come. Margaret, who had watched Alina's transformation from anxious young woman receiving an unexpected invitation to respected professor shaping palace policy, often teased her old friend about how far she had traveled from their childhood days chasing chickens through muddy lanes together. "Who would have imagined," Margaret said one evening, now married and raising a young daughter of her own, that the quiet girl who used to whisper Latin verbs to herself while helping her father sort old books would one day change how this entire kingdom thinks about who deserves a place in its halls of learning. Alina smiled at the memory, thinking often of her father during these later years, wishing he could have witnessed how fully his patient teaching had ultimately blossomed, not only within her own life, but within the lives of every young scholar who now found doors open that had once remained firmly closed against anyone who did not fit an old, familiar mold. She kept his notebooks still, displayed prominently upon the shelves of her now considerably larger office, alongside her own growing collection of research and correspondence. She often found herself returning to his careful, cramped handwriting during difficult moments, drawing quiet strength from his steady example, just as she had during that long, tense evening so many years earlier when she first sat down to translate a stubborn, ancient passage that had defeated scholars for decades. The manuscript itself, the very fragment that had first brought her into the palace's attention, eventually found a permanent home within a specially prepared display in the royal archive, accompanied by a small plaque describing both its ancient philosophical content and the more recent, remarkable story of its correct translation. Visitors to the archive often paused before the display, reading the brief account of a young woman who had once been told, quite confidently, that she could not read Latin, only to prove within a single evening that she understood it more deeply than anyone else in the room. Alina herself rarely spoke of that particular evening anymore, the passage of years having settled its dramatic edges into something closer to quiet, private satisfaction, rather than a story requiring frequent retelling. Yet occasionally, when a nervous young student arrived at her office for the first time, uncertain whether their own unconventional path toward learning might ever be taken seriously within these grand, ancient halls, she found herself sharing the story once more, not to boast of her own triumph, but to offer proof that persistence, careful patience, and honest, rigorous work could ultimately overcome even the most confidently dismissive doubt. "They will tell you what you cannot do," she often told these young students, echoing words her own father had once offered her across a small, candle-lit kitchen table many years earlier. "Sometimes they will believe it sincerely. Sometimes they will simply find it convenient to believe. Either way, the only answer that matters is the quality of the work you are willing to put before them, honestly and without apology." The palace's scholarly halls, once so distant and unreachable to a young woman raised in genteel poverty, taught nothing beyond what her father's patient guidance had already instilled, had become, over the passing years, not merely a place where Alina Whitmore had proven herself worthy of belonging, but a place she had helped reshape into something more genuinely open, more willing to judge merit on its own honest terms rather than the familiar shape of a scholar's expected origins. And somewhere, in whatever quiet way such things might be witnessed, she liked to believe her father saw it all, the daughter he had taught by candlelight finally standing not merely within the halls that had once excluded him, but standing there having widened the doorway for every patient, determined mind that would follow after her, regardless of where their own quiet education had first begun.